Hi, and welcome to the Philosopher's Clearinghouse. Premium thought at a wholesale price. Exploring the loci communis together. I'm your host, Calvinist Klein, a.k.a. Romans 9:18, a.k.a. Deep and Wide. Many people agreed with Jacobi's complaint against Kant that while unknowability and the denial of knowing things in themselves were a necessary foundation for Kantian thought, once one had accepted those postulates, one could not then meaningfully speak of knowing reality without contradiction. Many thought Kant was just mirroring a Berkeleyan idealism that reduced the empirical world to mind-dependent states of consciousness and mere representations. Kant insisted he was clear to distinguish between inside and outside objects and had defended a robust empirical realism, that we certainly did have knowledge of external objects outside of our mind's representation of it. But he equivocated on what outside of us amounted to, and used phenomenal language to talk about such subjects, and persisted in claiming that we were forever cut off from knowing things in themselves, and were prisoners of our mental representations. To some, like Jacobi, Kant seemed grossly inconsistent in mixing phenomenal objects with their noumenal counterparts. In defending his synthetic a priori knowledge, it was still not clear whether humankind actually had real knowledge of external things, or only just a second-rate knowledge of the appearance of external things. Further, the choice of using a dialectic as method for philosophy appeared to his critics as a dogmatic assertion, an example of the very thing that Kant had elsewhere rejected as unsuitable for philosophical inquiry. Others thought Kant had not gone far enough with his skepticism, and that he had merely catalogued the psychological workings of the human mind in a way that could not hope to apprehend the remote objects of the external world one was attempting to study. The transcendental aspect of Kant's philosophy was criticized as being no more than subjective and experiential, incapable of bridging the gap or transcending the distance between mind and reality. Others, such as Maimon, thought Kant was unable to universalize the building blocks of reality from the particulars of human experience. Kant thought the criticisms overstated and offered that the Kantian lantern of transcendental method was just another way of pointing out the obvious. We humans were finite and discursive in our knowing. Further, the only window on reality was sensory, and our minds could not supply content about reality on their own. There was no other sense of intellectual intuition. Kant concluded that human knowledge could not meet a gold standard of absolute knowledge, that is, God's knowledge of the object he had created. But he didn't think that this creator-creature distinction in quality of knowledge meant that creaturely human knowledge was therefore second-rate. And here was the sticking point. It was just such an intellectual intuition that philosophers like Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, and others insisted we did have. Some philosophers even proposed that Kant's dialectical transcendent method was itself an example of such an intellectual intuition, and not merely a product of sensation. Kant thought the dualism of his method was part of the unresolving tension intrinsic to dialectic, while critics thought it was a fatal absence, incompleteness, weakness, or ambiguity in Kant's philosophy. Additionally, there were different kinds of dualism to consider, such as the difference between reason and experience, between understanding what is and thinking about what is, between subject and object in general, between the theoretical and the practical, and most importantly, between freedom and necessity, the gap between moral responsibility, that is, doing what one ought to do, and the liberty of existence, that is, fulfilling the moral duty of doing what one freely chooses to do. Kant's critics thought that his philosophy was not grounded and was by its own admission not deducible according to his own method, and that his method must therefore be dogmatically presupposed, something which was against his own explicit rule for what made for good theological and philosophical method. Even one of Kant's earliest popularizers, Karl Reinhold, was one of those demanding more rigor and system. It seemed unacceptable to claim that freedom should be theoretically unknowable and nothing more than a practical and necessary postulate. Kant didn't think the critic's requirements was a bar that could be reasonably be met, nor could a complete deterministic system ever be fully worked out as a whole. He admitted that his analysis of human reason was an unpalatable affront to something generally believed to be a perennial feature of human thought. Even those who were ambitious to fulfill such a systematic requirement within Kant's system, like Fichte and Schelling, recognized that in going from a deconstructive form of criticism to a positive, constructive form of philosophical science, their works moved far from their original Kantian beginnings into something unrecognizable. Other efforts didn't fare any better. Those who proposed a subject-object identity to identify human judgments with objects in the world sounded bizarre, and claims that people should not speak about absolutes seemed self-refuting, as such a rejection of absolutes was itself an example of an absolute claim. Schelling asked an interesting question. Is the subject-object difference subjective or objective? And why would an original source or substance that was underlying reality, that was itself neither subject nor object, differentiate itself into subjects and objects? That is, between cabbages and kings, between act and potency, or between comings and goings. The whole enterprise seemed quite dark. Given this accusation of subjectivism and the skeptical approach to Kant's various dualisms, as well as a Spinozan ideal of substance as neither mind nor matter, no one could offer an adequate or comprehensible account of how all of these things could be put into their proper place. Some saw a limitation on the discursive nature of judgment, the tendency to separate that which was not truly separate into separately considered parts that incorrectly disregarded their unity. It seemed quite a stretch and hand-waving of a magic wand of transcendental argument to get to there from here. Such a philosophy seemed to be understood not by demonstration, but only through indirect way by art and aesthetics, especially by lyric poetry. But an appeal to the aesthetic was a profoundly unsatisfying way to construct an analytic and systematic philosophy.